Hi, Macon.
Hi, Jade.
So my name's Jade. I'm speaking to Macon Reed today, who is an artist as part of the Friendship as a Way of Life exhibition. Macon has made the amazing work Eulogy for the Dyke Bar, which is an installation work, which you see in the foyer space of the gallery. Macon's based in the US, is coming to us live from the state of New York, with a beautiful, beautiful background, a barn. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to Macon today. I'm just going to jump straight into it. I've got a bunch of questions that I printed on lavender colored paper, which seemed appropriate. So I wanted to jump in and just start by asking you about your practice more broadly, and then I guess how this particular project sits within your practice.
Yeah, that's always a good question to start with. Eulogy for the Dyke Bar is actually kind of a great example of all the components of my practice coming together. And I feel like it was the first time where I was really able to do that. So I do sculpture and video and performance. I also have a background in community organizing and documentary radio. So a lot of sort of interviewing people and oral history. So the Dyke Bar was kind of this way that I was able to bring those components together and have them all sort of balance each other. But in general, my practice is heavily sculpture influenced, and I really like to make these sort of environments, these installations that are immersive and people can kind of walk inside of them and have a sort of step outside of their everyday, and then kind of be open to conversation. So something that's a little different about the work is that a lot of times people will either do sort of socially engaged artworks or they'll do sculpture and installation, but I really believe that when they come together, they can be the most powerful. So the programs that we have like inside the Dyke Bar space are just as much a part of the artwork as the sculptural components are, if that makes sense.
Totally. It's there's something that struck me about the work, that it feels like that sort of queer otherworld making, which is kind of what the Dyke Bar is itself in the community, is this otherworld place, and you've kind of doubly created that with the work. It's kind of interesting, I guess, with everything that's happening with COVID, that we've got this, I guess, different relationship to your installation in this iteration as opposed to how it's been installed previously. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on that?
I mean, it's been really surreal to know that the project is happening on the other side of the world. And everything that I've heard about the queer community in Sydney is that it's amazing and it's the queerest place in Australia, and I have to go there. And so I think it's felt it's just sort of surreal to know that it's happening there. And again, I wish I could be there to meet everyone. And there's been such an amazing team of people that have brought it together there. So I think it also feels surreal because here, the US has handled COVID in a terrible way. And so really, being in queer spaces feels like such another life, honestly, right in this moment. Like I would love to walk into a Dyke Bar or almost any space, the only place that in New York we still have that's now too cold to go to is Reese Beach, which is like the traditional queer beach that's been in New York for years. And so I went there the other day and I thought, oh my God, I haven't been around other queer people in so long in these numbers. So I think that maybe in a sense it feels kind of heartening to know that at least there's this space on the other side of the planet that's kind of being a queer space. And I know that the programming there has had to change a little bit around it too. So it's just a weird time to be doing anything.
I totally hear that. I guess it's been interesting. I watched the video that was made around your work, and I think a different installation of it. And there was a lot of footage from the sort of final night of the installation, and it was like the whole space was activated, this sort of reflective space, and it had something of like what I think about when I think of Dyke Nights in Sydney is like, it's that performative space and that sharing space and that intergenerational space. So it's interesting, or it's actually kind of sad that it's not able to realize its potential in that way, but it's still serving the purpose of the memorial aspect as the eulogy aspect to the work. It's doing that in spades at the moment as this sort of monument to this counter commons, this counter space. Yeah, no, it's really a weird time. So in terms of the construction of the work, why those materials? Because it's it's made out of quite fragile materials rather than, you know, having an actual pool table, or what's the idea behind that?
You know, that's a good question. I should say, like, in one part, like those, so the materials I often use are, unless it needs to be sort of really strong and hold, you know, a weight, or a person's going to sit on it or something, like the stools in the bar. I generally work with a lot of cardboard and paper mache or paper clay over it. And part of why I work with those materials is because I'm sort of an impatient, fast, sort of feral maker, and I can work with them very quickly. But also they're more recyclable and more biodegradable than a lot of materials that people use in contemporary sculpture. So that feels important. And then when I was a younger student, we had this like super macho bro guy in the shop, the wood shop, and he just made it really uncomfortable for any of us to go in there. So I sort of put this very weird practice together, just very heavily based in cardboard and paper and sort of simple, fast materials. And while it was like adapting to sort of a difficult situation, I think that it's made for being able to build out these worlds quickly. And I think that the way that they look, I really like things to look like sort of handsy, like you can see that a human hand made it, because so many things that we interact with every day look so polished, you can't see that, you know, there was a human behind every object that we touch. And so I think there's something about this sort of lumpy, playful, bright, like almost aggressively bright aesthetic that also kind of pulls people in. But a lot of it is honestly because I really am a quick maker, and those materials feel like easy and accessible and not too precious, you know.
And then again, I guess in and of itself, it becomes reflective of the space in like the Dyke Bar again as well. It's fast, it's thrown together, it's adaptive, it's a survival strategy, it's all of these things. So it's totally just sort of feeds back in. It's very meta.
Working on like you know, at this point my career's changed, but when I started out in particular, you know, really working with a very low budget to make community spaces happen, you know. And so like the first iteration of the Eulogy for the Dyke Bar project actually happened because we joke in the US that these are our artist grants because we don't have good infrastructure here for the arts, but I got hit by a car and
wow.
got a very small, relatively, it was an uninsured driver. I got a small amount of money out of it. But that's actually what made the first Dyke Bar project happen. So a lot of it is, and I say this to my students that I work with, that, you know, there are these materials that are really cheap and kind of fast and overlooked, but I still think there's a lot that can be done with them. And when we're kind of like stuck with the challenge of working with a small budget, I think sometimes good things come out of it. Not to romanticize being a poor artist, but you know, I think that kind of ties into what Dyke Bar's experience too. You're right.
Yeah, totally. And well, I guess that leads to the next part of the installation, which is the source material, the documentation, the framed images on the walls. Do you want to talk a little bit about where they came from? They look like archival material.
Yeah, they do. And I guess maybe I should say something too, a little bit about like how I came to make the project, because that might inform
yes, definitely.
You know, yeah. So just like the quick background on that was just really, I was living in Chicago at the time, and I had just moved from a very dikey city in the US, Portland, Oregon. And found myself, really there wasn't anywhere for queer people like me to go, really. Our queer neighborhood or gay neighborhood in the city was called Boys Town, and it really was for boys, and mostly cisgendered, wealthier ones. And so I started talking to my friends and saying, like, where's the place for us to cruise, and where's the place for us to be, and where can I find more people like me? And I came up on all these stereotypes within the queer community that I find really prevalent, at least in the US. I'm not sure, but I suspect they go international sometimes, but that, that dykes and when I should also say, when I say, I'm going to use words like dyke and queer pretty interchangeably here, but the project is really centered around inclusion and thinking about also the question of what it means to have a space for all the people who would want to be in that space now, because we're sort of in this amazing moment where things are opening up in terms of language, but the language hasn't caught up to, so, just sort of ask for people's patience in talking about things like that. But a big thing I heard was, dykes aren't as sexual, aren't as cruisy, don't like to party as much, sort of all of these sort of ideas. And I was like, is that true? Like, a lot of people I know believed these things, or that we like to U-Haul, in the US, at least that means like you basically start dating someone. Yeah,
we have the same thing here. Different vehicle.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I started leaning into it and trying to understand it. And what I learned is that actually so much of these sort of differences are really based in socioeconomics and differences of privilege historically. So in the US, at least, historically, especially back in like maybe the 30s, 40s, and 50s, like you would have a situation where a woman was always expected to have a husband for another source of income. So we got paid way less. There were very few jobs. And then we were supposed to, we were always assumed to have this other source of income that would kind of make that be okay. So you have this interesting situation where actually femmes were more able to get those jobs because they were sort of more able to pass as straight, whereas a lot of more butch or masculine people couldn't get work or couldn't get consistent work. And so the femmes became the breadwinners, so that you have this whole population that's historically living off of way less money and supporting more people. And so the sort of the opportunity to even go to a bar and be able to spend that money was a really different thing, and there were a lot of laws in the books in the States at certain points where you couldn't, as a woman, you couldn't go in and get a drink in a bar without a man with you, like in any bar, straight bar. And so, when I leaned into that and started thinking about how that sort of plays out in terms of gentrification and all of these things, I started to realize, oh, this is about something really different. It's a sort of double standard around gender and everything that even within the queer community we don't talk about a lot. So that felt like it was like, and then I talked to my friend who's a sociologist, and this sort of led me towards the archives, which will respond to that question. But for the record, in the US, apparently at least, U-hauling is not done more by lesbians than anyone else. Apparently cis gay men will do it the most often, at least according to her research. So I thought that was really interesting, where I was like, wait a minute, I don't know.
Very vindicating.
Yeah, and also of lesbian bed death. That is also something that doesn't affect that community more than any other. So anyway, just sort of leaned into this stuff, and I thought, where can I find more information? So I learned about this incredible project that we had come and join us at the second iteration of the project, which is called Last Call New Orleans, and they're based out of New Orleans, Louisiana here, and they do a Dyke Bar history podcast specifically focused on Dyke bars by Black and brown women in New Orleans. And so they were kind of, I started listening to that and getting to learn more about that history. And then I learned about this place called the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn, which I love because basically it's in a brownstone house. It's not in an official institution building. And you just go in there, and usually there are some either very sweet or very grumpy older dykes who will hang out and bring you iced tea. And it's like incredible because they aren't just archiving things from important queer people, like if you have a partner that passes away and you want their stuff to go into the archive, you just drop it off and it's there. So it's this huge like labor of love and it's been open for decades. I forget exactly when it actually opened. But I went and just hung out there and went through the kind of crazy, like they try to organize it, but they have very, I think limited funding and staff. So it's a little bit like, like this giant pile of information, and you're weeding through it to try to find something about, Dyke Bars and whenever. And, and so I would find them, but then, also the ability to find photos from, way back when, or even just like a couple decades ago, and inside those spaces was so hard because, again, at least in the US, we would have this situation where, police raids happened all the time in these spaces. So you could be there and the bar would get raided, and then they'd take you outside and take a picture of you, put your picture in the paper, and then you could lose your family and your job and everything. So, it was really limited. And so especially trying to find images of women of color, for example, from like the 40s and 50s felt almost impossible. So feeling really excited about that archive, and also recognizing the limitations of who gets prioritized even within that archive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, I learned a lot.
Yeah.
And all of the images that I ended up choosing are a real combination of flyers from events that happened, flyers for communities trying to look for help after the police have come in and raided or beat people up, trying to deal with ways the city was shutting them down. I also I love that you can see there's a letter from this woman who owned Bonnie and Clyde's that closed in 1981 in New York. It's right next to the Facebook post from the owner of the Lexington in 2015, and they're citing really similar things. So I felt like, it just felt important to not just have sculptures of things, but actually bring some of the faces and history directly into the space,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It must have been really interesting, or I guess to try and, what am I trying to say? It must have been really interesting to be able to reach into those different moments in time and totally immerse yourself in that physical space as well. The physical space of going into the archive.
Yeah.
Like that's really something, because, I'm a total history nerd as well. So that very much appeals to me. But it's interesting because, unfortunately, when I was brought in to pull together some of the Sydney-based or the Australian-based material, it was exactly when lockdown hit here.
Oh, no.
So I was so excited to actually go visit the Australian Gay and Lesbian archives down in Melbourne, but I couldn't because the borders shut and everything just sort of happened, and I was like, oh gosh. So it was really interesting to have like a converse or a very different research experience where I was purely rolling online to try and find material, and that was even more difficult, to try and find whatever had been possibly digitized, and then trying to reach out to people I know, also then trawling through my own stuff. Fortunately, I kept hold of flyers from Dyke nights from 10, 15 years ago. So I had that sort of stuff on hand. But it's a really interesting experience to just to totally self-reflect on your own position within the queer community and your personal relationship to these spaces, because I was like, this is like a totally personal journey for me. I totally, it was really like very pleasurable to think back to those, first times of walking into, lesbian nights here in Sydney rather than a Dyke Bar. We've only ever had one Dyke Bar, which was Ruby Reds, and then it was reopened as Ruby's, but that was closed long before I came of age. But we've always had these regular nights that have often been built around performance, queer performance art as well. So it was really pleasurable to have that self-reflexive a moment in, I guess, doing my little bit to kind of help this installation come into fruition. But I wonder for you, like, how evocative that was for you being in the archive and whether that
Yeah.
brought back certain like particular bars, particular moments for you.
Yeah.
Can you remember anything in particular?
I mean, I also want to just say thanks for putting in such an effort the way you did, because it was just like a wild time to try to put anything together.
Oh,
So
it was
just
my pleasure. Like I was like, oh, you're asking me to do this. I'll do this like for
great.
fun. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think a few things stand out to me. I mean, one, just realizing that similar to kind of what you were saying, like I also kind of came of age just after, like, there were dyke bars that I went to, but most of them were gone pretty quickly after I found them, or they were maybe spaces that felt like they were obsolete in some ways, even that, even, which I feel terrible saying, but they felt kind of like a relic even as I was in them, which was strange. And through the archives, I mean, for one, just they have so much stuff there, and it's amazing. And I love seeing the actual images, but there's also, and reading, I remember finding this letter where I felt like I understood so much about my experience in queer community at this point, because it was like from the 70s, and it was a bunch of dykes and lesbians kind of yelling at each other on paper, like, I'm not a dyke, I'm a lesbian, and the other one being like, no, I'm a lesbian, not a dyke. And I was like, wow, we've been fighting each other around language and self-definition and identity for so long. And it kind of helped me understand some of the trajectories over time. Like, that there are things that I find frustrating or sad at any given moment in the sort of trajectory of being a queer person as we like figure out our world, but if I attach to any of them in a particular moment, it can be frustrating or upsetting, but there's this like larger picture where, even if we drive each other crazy sometimes, which I definitely seen groups of queers do here at least, it's sort of on this arc towards change, and I really wanted to start to interrupt the generational paradigm a little bit around that, because it has so much to do with, what your experience is coming out into the world is so different than someone who's 10, 20 years or more younger, older than you. And so I think that came through in the archives. Like it's mostly older dykes who are keeping it around. They've got some younger interns in there now, but feeling like, wow, these are, even though generationally there's sort of, there are definitely battles and fights that are happening and different kind of paradigms happening, but I think that there's so much incredible work that queer elders have done for us to be able to stand on the ground that we can stand on and then be critical of them from. Like that ground only exists because of the work that they did. And so
totally,
really feeling like wow, how can we change this, and learning so much from speaking with older dykes in the archives. Like I love looking at the things, but I loved even more talking to the people. And I think that when we did the queer memoir, the first version at the Dyke Bar, which was basically kind of, for people who don't know about it, it was kind of a eulogy ritual is what we called it, but I just had people come up and tell stories about being in Dyke Bars. And they were the best part. I mean, we had it in a sort of age and gender spectrum there, but my favorite thing was listening to the elders talk about their experiences, and particularly there was someone named Jade Muratore who she was kicked out of her home at 15 for coming home with a crew cut. She's very butch. And she then lived in the park across the street from Stonewall, which is the bar where, an important big first uprising in the US happened. And so she was actually living in that park and was there that night and was talking about what that was like, and talking about how at the time in the States, if you weren't wearing at least 3 pieces of gender appropriate clothing, the police could just pick you up and throw you in jail, So she got thrown to jail for being gender nonconforming, like on a regular basis. But then she said that was also how she met all her dates, So it was like, they just put them all together. And she talked about having finding like cigarette filters, that they could like put in the lock so that it wouldn't close all the way. So at night when the guards weren't looking, they would run around and,
how fantastic.
And it was just amazing. And I think that, it really stood out to me that after that event, that the younger people who came were really touched by getting to listen to elders speak, because, there really aren't enough kind of moments for that, especially part of the problem with the Dyke Bar, with bar and dancing culture is it's a late night younger people affair, and we don't have a lot of sort of structures culturally, at least here, for getting to know queer elders. So I think that the big thing that came out of the archive for me was just like, this longing to connect across that time and to learn from people who came before me, and just how many examples of people really fighting for each other that there were in that space. So
Totally.
yeah,
It's the same. It's the same thing here, and the same longing that I have as well. And that same, I guess, and I guess when with the rise of digital culture, that's kind of created, I guess, maybe less of a impetus for some people to go into public spaces or shared communal spaces, and it's just this locking off of history, which I think has also fed this assumption in the younger generation, that the younger generation are the more progressive and the older generation have the limited ideas, and they're much more sort of backward in their politics. And it's as soon as you start to actually unravel and look at these conversations, you realize that the same, like, what you're talking about, the same split around conversations around language and class have been existing like probably since the beginning. I've just I read about the feminist, like the queer feminist movement in France recently, and looking at people like Monique Wittig and Hélène Cixous and Simone de Beauvoir, and I learned a lot about how fragmented even that movement was, and there was the split between the essentialists and the materialists, and Monique Wittig,
different essentialists, and
I know, and it's just like, okay, history just keeps repeating itself. But I was like, I guess there's something that's sort of rung true, is that Monique Wittig had this statement that she made that caused a furor, which was that a lesbian isn't a woman, that lesbians aren't women. And it was actually her addressing the question of language and the specificity of gender. And she, that was decades ago, she made that statement, and it caused such an explosion of conversation. But I'm like, in relation to talking about dyke bars and what dyke means or what lesbian means, how flexible that terminology can be when basically purely by choice, like you can self-select into it and you can make it what you want to make it, and it doesn't have to have the limitations. And I think that's something that rings true in your work, and in terms of trying to unpack what else dyke means and what else community means, and it's all kind of coming through.
I definitely, it felt super important to me that like on all of the sort of literature or like anything about the project, there was always a little statement that just really said, like, we're thinking about dyke in the most sort of fluid and expansive way possible, and essentially leaving room for, like, if you feel an affiliation or an allyship with dyke culture, then you're welcome here, and even in the phrasing, like I think I say something like past, present, or future, opening for the fact that, like, gender can shift again and again and again, depending on people's experiences. And I think, like, circling back to the previous point a little bit, one of the things that I've kind of joked with some of the younger queers in my life who feel frustrated with elders who maybe don't understand them, or aren't given the chance to really ask questions and work out understanding, I'd even say sometimes, is that no matter what identity or background you're from, the only thing that we have in common if we stay alive is we will all become old. And so I really believe that the way that we treat people that are older than us is, also significant, because it's the world that we're creating for ourselves to come into. Because at some point, like even now, the sort of queer world that I am immersed in is different than that of someone who's maybe 18, and here has, like, in many ways more options and resources and things than I had. So, I think with that too, that older people, like, need to do the work around making sure they're open to what the younger queers are bringing into the world too. It's sort of like can go both ways. But yeah, I think the term dyke, you know, like I totally identify as a dyke, and I often date trans guys, and they, you know, that doesn't kind of, if the old idea of dyke was one thing, then that's probably not what I am now, but it's something more of a spirit, and being connected to a lineage and a sort of like heritage of people. And I think it also, for me personally, has something to do with my own gender, and the way that looks. So if whether I'm dating somebody on the more feminine or masculine end of a spectrum, that sort of, it's more situated within me than it is about the exterior.
Yeah,
but that's
absolutely.
kind of like how I think about it, you know.
Yeah. And more of a way of, I always think about it more as a way of being and doing rather than a hard line identity. I don't, it's not about being locked in. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it also has to do with, for me, like kind of when people sort of make these differentiations between gayness and queerness, if there is one, that there's a sort of like an inherent feminist and sort of social critique that comes with that word and that identity for me too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, preaching to the choir. I'm like, me too. What was I going to ask? About the death of the Dyke Bar more broadly. You've already kind of touched on it already in terms of the questions around I guess gentrification and things like that, but if you wanted to maybe talk about that more, just in terms of what you think has been that sort of process over the past few decades.
It's a strange one. I think that it's sort of like there's no sort of single reason for the Dyke Bar to go away, so much as that each place has kind of its own constellation of things. But the things from, I mean, I talked to so many people. I also had this long list of what we were calling dead Dyke bars, which is kind of a brutal name when I think about it, but these Dyke bars don't exist anymore. You know, there's one, I forget where it was, there's one called Mother's Milk that I was like, wow.
That's a great name.
But, you know, so yeah, like the financial piece is like, in a lot of ways, it's not even about what Dyke bars are gone, but how few Dyke bars could come into existence in the first place compared to bars for cis gay men, or obviously for straight people. So less in the first place. We definitely, there's another piece though that I think is interesting, which is like, as queer liberation moves forward more, and like someone said in one of the versions of the project, you know, we can go to Applebee's now, which is a terrible chain restaurant in the US. But it's kind of like, do you need to go to a Dyke bar? Like now that we are sort of assimilated and accepted more broadly in mainstream culture, there's this sort of sad, weird other side of it, which is that people might not need a Dyke bar in the same way, as in like the only place to find other queer people, the only place to go on a date. And so I push back on that. Ultimately, I really feel like it's really important for us to have a space, and to not just have it be a night of the month in a bar that's usually for other people, but ideally one that exists all the time. Because one thing that really stood out to me in talking to like Shelley Weiss, who is one of the elders who spoke to, was that in the 70s, like all of her political activism was organized at the Dyke Bar, not during a dance night, but during, you know, an afternoon beer to talk about whatever. And so I think that we do really need those spaces. But assimilation, that's a big one. That's a strange one to sit with. And the money piece, I think apps, like people can find each other on dating apps. I do think that's affecting things more, although there's still, most of the apps are geared towards straight people or gay men generally. It seems like in the US, at least, we know people try to launch it, but it never quite hits. And I think in part because gender is so fluid and they can't figure out the algorithms for us or something. But so that piece, and then
that's so true.
You know, they're like, well, she likes this person and that person.
But yesterday it was yeah.
And so that's part of it. And then I also think like we're in a moment, like I said earlier, where it's like to try to find inclusion for all the people in all of our different gender expressions, while also making space for those that need it. It's a really, I don't have any sort of like I haven't figured that one out, you know. But I feel like Dyke Bars, I know lots of people who used to feel like a Dyke Bar was for them, and now their gender has sort of shifted, and now they're kind of like, but I'm not a dyke, but I also, that's a space where I felt at home. And, you know, and obviously for trans women and trans feminine people, like making sure they feel like they're part of that. And then, but then how does that relate to like it just gets really complicated, I think. And so it's a good complication. It's one that I think we need, but I think that we, instead of a dyke bar, it's kind of like a everybody but these particular cis guys bar. That's kind of like what people are often saying, you know. But
but trying to still say it politely. But that's
and then there's the other thing of like, you know, within queer communities there's plenty of misogyny, and so you know, women, cis and trans alike, like also could probably do well to have spaces that are focused on us, you know. And so that's also tricky. It just gets, and that's, but I think that that's sort of part of the conversation is part of what makes sort of branding work, you know, or difficult in this moment. And I've had some interesting conversations with people who've run dyke bars, who've sort of made that space for inclusion a priority, but still are kind of clunky in their language and still kind of can't figure it out. So I think that's kind of part of the mix, even though it's not a direct reason that bars are going away or something, but I think that we are in a moment where I think it's important to redefine what groups our queer spaces are even for.
Totally.
You know?
I think constellation is the right word in terms of all of the influences that are creeping in. And even just like, I mean, it comes down, I mean, it all comes back down to language, doesn't it? It comes back down to language, and it comes back down to, I don't know, capitalism, I guess. Is
money. I know.
Money and language. But, you know, just the question of queer and that conflation over the years of queer and queer politics alongside gay and lesbian liberation, sort of progressivist movements that have had the sort of more, I guess, assimilationist objective that is a different politics, arguably, and a different social mode than someone who identifies as queer.
It's true. And then
so it's kind of like this complication.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, you know, there's sort of like gay and lesbian liberation, there's queerness, there's transness. And I think that like all of these, and then throw in feminism too. I think feminisms, you know, they all have a lot of touchstones like in common, but are also different. And so I think that there's this, it's an interesting time. I know that the thing I found is like in San Francisco, which is sort of famous for being our gay city here, you know, like they don't have any dyke bars. There's not one dyke bar in the Bay Area. There's still the Castro for gay men, but there's not one dyke bar. And meanwhile, Richmond, Virginia, which is where I went to college and is not a hotbed of queerness, they still have a dyke bar because they still need one, because it's not safe to go to other places. So I think that it's a weird thing, assimilation, you know, when we get it.
Yeah, totally. But I completely agree with you in terms of feeling a real pull to there still being those sorts of spaces carved out, even if we, I don't know whether we rebrand them as queer, but there is something built into dyke or lesbian that binds queerness or, you know, non-normative sexuality to a feminist politics that it creates a particular kind of space that, I don't know, I guess for me as a cisgendered lesbian woman, I feel safer in that space versus going to like more of a mainstream like gay night or something where it does feel slightly more hostile in regards to misogyny or
or just not
you
not
just feel
focused.
less visible,
not centered, you know, like it's about I think it's centered in a space, and that is something that I've been kind of, and people probably pick up on it and me saying this tonight, but I think it's time for cis gay men to start really doing more work to make spaces more inclusive and equitable. I think that that women's spaces have made lots of mistakes for sure in that process, but are in general, at least here, working towards that. And I think that there's a sort of double standard of kind of thinking like, oh, those guys are just dudes and whatever. But I think that there are, you know, I have a lot of cis gay men in my life too who feel vocal and supportive of doing this inclusion work and thinking about things more expansively, not just in terms of inclusion of like who can come to the bar, but also like sharing resources, you know, because men generally get paid more than women and other queers do. And so they have more capital to like be able to share those resources. So just having those conversations of saying like, if we are going to kind of umbrella ourselves under LGBTQ, you know, IA plus, that all those people need to like help each other out and be in solidarity, you know. So if you're listening, guys, it's time to come in, you know, to help us keep our spaces around and make them feel inclusive for people. That's my, I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, stay on the soapbox. I want to jump on the soapbox too, because you know, it's about that, having those like, it's thinking of community beyond the dance floor, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
It's thinking about just people in their spaces living their lives, you know, and I guess the other kind of progressive work that we want to do beyond our intimate relationships or beyond what happens in the dance floor. And so, you know, to have those spaces for collective coming together, to politically organize, to just share experiences, to jump into histories, that all just seems like the necessary work that's gonna get us, you know, somewhere else, somewhere better, or somewhere, particularly at a time like this.
Oh my gosh, yeah, totally.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. What was I going to ask? Do you feel like there are any spaces that prior to COVID that sort of meet that objective for you, like particular queer events, or do you have alternative ways of coming together with friends that kind of do that work as well?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I mean, there are a couple bars in New York that I love and will plug if anybody ever comes. There's Henrietta Hudson's, which is the longest running Dyke Bar in New York City. It's also struggling right now. So they have a GoFundMe. I just posted about it actually on my Facebook page. But because they're really, it's pretty hard to stay open right now. But Lisa, who runs it, it's great. She's been kind of adapting and shifting, and it's also really it's a very like racially mixed space, which I also really value a lot. So that space, I feel like, you know, I can go in, there are like a variety of gender and other identities in the space, but it feels sort of like a, you know, that sort of feminism meets queerness dykey space that I like. And then there's another place called Ginger's in Brooklyn that we still go to, you know, and for my research for the project, I just had to go to all the Dyke bars.
What a terrible problem.
I know, it was really hard. Yeah, and you know, that's sort of like a casual like place where we tend to go and meet for like quieter nights. It's not necessarily like a rager place. And there's the Cubbyhole in New York, but that gets really crowded and everyone's like 22. And now that I'm a professor, I prefer to not only be around 22-year-olds because it feels weird. You know, so I like that that's not so much my space, but I like that it exists. There was a party for a long time organized in Chicago that I loved that was called Chances Dances. Some friends of mine organized it, and they just had, you know, it was like basically for all the genders and for everybody, and it roved, and you know, and straight people were in the mix, but it just felt like centering queerness, but it kind of changed depending on which location it was at, and that project was pretty amazing, even though it was a sort of brick and mortar space. I think for me, the sort of place where the two places I can think of in the US that I feel most kind of at home in terms of queerness and kind of being with my people there's one called Ida in Tennessee, which is in a rural area here, where like, you know, queer people usually don't get to live rurally in mass. It's usually like that's like where there's nobody to date or whatever. And so this one part of Middle Tennessee has a number of these queer land projects at it, and they have a festival every year called Idapalooza. That's sort of a fundraiser, and it's like all queer and female bands. And I think that space, because we're really outside on the land, maybe in the tradition of dykes on the land, but you know, that it just feels like we're able to really create our own world in a way there that I haven't experienced anywhere else. So I think there's also something about like being outside of cities that's interesting. And then Jacob Riis' speech, which I mentioned earlier in the call, in Queens in New York, is absolutely like the most, it's like all the body types, all the ages, all the genders, all the races, all the everybody, like it's just incredible. That's probably like the queerest place that I'll ever get to be. So yeah, I miss it. It's getting
Yeah,
cold.
no, I know. Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's it kind of sucks for you guys that it all happened. COVID hit just when summer was coming in. That's got to be difficult.
Yep.
Yeah. We've got our summer coming in now. So we've got all the sort of hope in the air, everything that kind of comes with spring, and you're like, this is not going to be the same. And some of the parties, well, go to the beach while I can. But I guess to provide, I guess, the Sydney variation of like your experience as well. Like definitely there's been a deterioration of the number of dyke nights that have been happening over at least the past 20 years. There was definitely a lot more. When I started going out, I was 17, and I was like lesbian night every Wednesday in Newtown, which is a suburb in the inner west of Sydney, and that's got a history of being quite a queer and lesbian town. And there was a bar, Sly Fox, and they would have a drag king night every Wednesday. So that was my first sort of initiation into not just like lesbian culture, but also queer culture as well, and queer performance, because Sydney's got a really significant history of queer performance in club spaces. So, you know, that's no longer, but that was a really formative experience. And then we had another really fantastic regular-ish night called Girlesque, which was a like a burlesque night for lesbian trans folk. And that was incredible in terms of the most sort of like bent, kinky performance art, you know, you could kind of picture. That was a really, really awesome space, which again, unfortunately no longer, but we do still have some parties that have endured that actually tend to be the most queer and the most inclusive and the most mixed in terms of gender, sexuality, like race, all those sorts of things. And one that really stands out is Club Kooky, which has been going for decades, and it used to be a fixture at a bar called Club 77, which is in King's Cross, which is actually where I live, not in the bar but in the cross. But that now happens as like a party that happens just sort of a couple of times a year, and it's just it's like it's almost religious the way the whole thing like plays out. They still sell tickets, like hard, like paper tickets. You line up at a local queer-owned store to get your tickets. So there's like a social component to lining up to buy your tickets, you know, ahead of time. That becomes a whole event. And as queers taking over the street, like there was a store just up the road here, and I'm in an area that's been quite gentrified. So it was really glorious to walk up the street one day and just have this massive queue of about 100+ queers just lining up the streets of a very gentrified area. But that's a real, pardon?
What
was
time
that?
of year does it usually happen?
Yes, so we always have one for Mardi Gras. So Mardi Gras is a really big deal in Sydney and has been since the first protests in '78. So it began as a protest march and is now more of a parade in the way that I think it's become a parade in a lot of places over the world, like a pride parade. But the day after the parade and the party, we have Club Kooky is one of the sort of offerings for the queer community, and it happens in different locations. So the different bars, and they've done a couple of iterations in the forecourt of the Sydney Opera House. We have like a light festival in June called Vivid. So we've had that party built into the festival program. And that's kind of incredible to have like hundreds of queers just on the sort of open forecourt in front of the Opera House.
I miss those
in the harbour.
Even being possible of that sounds so great right now.
Yeah. So that's like I don't think it's going to happen again for a little while. But that's a party that I definitely probably miss the most because it's always feels the most inclusive.
Yeah.
The folks who run it do an incredible job at making it an incredibly inclusive space, and it's one that I'm really keen to see come back again. But other than that, we do have a theatre venue in Marrickville, which is another suburb with a big kind of queer community. It was a theatre venue called the Red Rattler that was started by five queer women, and that's kind of become a semi, I guess, sort of self-running, autonomous-ish sort of space now, and that's been a place where a lot of queer parties and different events have happened, queer film festivals and all that, and then we have in Redfern a fantastic little bar called the Bearded Tit, which is another queer-owned bar, which is again, none of these spaces are exclusionary at all. I think that's part of what makes them stay as great as they are, and gives them that longevity.
I think it's because also, I mean, the more diversity we have on all the levels, obviously the more dynamic and compelling any community is, and I think that's the sort of thing about this sort of moment of what a Dyke Bar means. And Eulogy really was like, in part to sort of honor and memorialize those places, and to draw attention to the fact that a lot of them are gone, but also to really make us try to think a little bit more mindfully about what alternative kind of community spaces might be available, and I know some people voiced during the project too, there's a lot of sober people who want to be part of things but don't want to go to a place where everybody's wasted, and so I think there are just so many things to sort of think about when we are thinking about what makes a community space, and what makes it actually vibrant. There's suddenly mosquitoes flying around. I think it's getting darker. That's amazing.
You're talking to an Australian, so we know all about mosquitoes and flies here. Yeah. Well, I think it's something that I've been ruminating on quite a bit. Again, to bring things back to COVID for a second, but just that I've found in the last few months, in terms of trying to stay connected with friends and still maintain a connection to community, it's involved doing, things that don't involve the club, which is kind of like a shocking, rude awakening. But going to friends' houses for dinner, or having like a book club night, or doing trying to sort of find ways to kind of tease out ways of being together that for the sake of the pandemic, COVID friendly. But I'm I wonder if this is partly hopefully going to kind of rewire our brains a little to thinking a bit more outside the box, to the point that you made about how can we create these alternate spaces that are just that aren't geared around hooking up and drinking and dancing, that are about other more humble pursuits.
And maybe combining the things, or Yeah, I mean, here we've been having some like bonfires during the full moon where people dance far away from each other, but at least there's loud music and bodies around. It feels like something, but
Yeah.
yeah, it is going to be really interesting. I mean, and I think in the States, because because of our terrible government situation and because of the handling of COVID, which are obviously linked, so many spaces are going to be disappearing and getting hit really hard. I think it's been interesting too, just to think about what we can learn from like the AIDS and HIV crisis, you know, and the way that queers learn to find communication around safer sex and various different practices that eventually, like, you know, everyone else needed to learn and benefit from. And I feel like a lot of those conversation skills have actually been coming into handy during this time, you know, because it's a little bit like when you're potting with someone, you know, it's like, well, what are your practices, and like, who have you been hanging out with, and what are their practices?
Oh my gosh, that's so true. I never thought about it like that, but yeah, it is.
A lot of
It's
overlap,
exactly.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, all the polyamorous folks that are struggling because it's so much harder to go between multiple people when you have to have 2 weeks in a test or choose one or whatever. Anyway, I think that we're all, there are a lot of different aspects of queerness and queer culture that are shifting right now, you know?
Yes. Yeah. But I think, yeah, I like to remain hopeful. Like, I think that, yeah, it's a resilience that's built into who we are as people by virtue of having to navigate the world as it is already. So maybe we're the best kind of people to ride the wave and arrive at whatever's on the other side. Hopefully something.
I think ultimately I feel optimistic too.
Yeah.
This last week or two here it's getting a little harder to be optimistic, but I'm trying to fight to like be like, maybe this is the moment where it can all change and we can learn and something better will come out. But yeah, to everyone listening, be happy that you're on that side of the planet, I think.
Oh dear. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, but all of these things are things that I think about a lot and I think are so important. And I'm really I wish that I could be there in person to hear what, you know, students and other people who come to the gallery, what their thoughts are, because I feel like I learned so much from younger queer people in my life about what might be possible, you know. So I'm really grateful that the installation's been, you know, having an impact and starting conversations there in the way that I keep hearing that it has. And I'm just really excited that I am part of the show, and someday we'll come and visit.
Yes, please do. That would be, I mean, it would be incredible to have the installation. Well, I would love to see the installation again in an iteration where it's also activated as that space. But like I said earlier, it's kind of, there's something really timely about how everything unfolded and what it means as this, memorial space. It's almost like an empty church or something. That's certainly kind of what it felt like for me first time I walked into that space, and actually even moving through the whole exhibition as well. It felt, I think that's just, I mean, there's something about the Dyke Bar in particular, because I think of all these sort of queer spaces as, like, I guess, you know, more atheist, kind of queer cathedral of sorts. Like, I always think about the dance floor as a kind of like, you know, spiritual space in a lot of senses. Like, it's got the same sorts of things built into it around like ritual and coming together, and it can kind of give you that connection to the past and to like
literally just like so together, not on our phones, you know.
Kind
of magic now.
So it's kind of provided an interesting sort of contemplative space, quiet kind of contemplative space of thinking through like a queer relation to space and time, and
Yeah.
and communities. So yeah, it hasn't all been a bad outcome, but it's just a different it's wearing a different skin.
Different. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because the project really was always meant to function in kind of two ways, and one of them was as that sort of reflective, contemplative space, you know, and I think that's why the archival images felt so important, was that people could kind of come and be in the space and kind of maybe only be there with one or two people and think about what it would mean for the places to not exist at all anymore, to kind of go extinct. And then, you know, during the activations, when we have like the queer memoir, or when we've had you know, drag performances, we had Dyke trivia, all of these things, like that's when it also then becomes the community space. And I think that it's kind of important to experience the project from both aspects, because they inform each other. Yeah, I mean, one funny thing that happened when we had the trivia night, I'll just say quickly, is that we had some elders, queer elders in the group, and it was just so funny because they just crushed all of us, because we were like, you know, what was the march that happened in blah blah year about whatever, and they were like, I organized that, I did that, I was there, you know, like, and it was just like they just like all just like we didn't, you know, so that was a just a funny moment of also, you know, like they obviously won the trivia night, but also recognizing like, wow, you guys really do hold so much that I want to get to be around and hear from you. So,
and to that point, in terms of works that you're making now, do you have anything that you're working on that is carrying on that sort of legacy?
You know, truthfully, the last project I did was kind of in response to He Who Shall Not Be Named being elected here in the US, and feeling a real sense that I needed to start working beyond kind of just a queer community and kind of do a project that could bring a lot of different people into a space. So I ended up building a sort of similar aesthetic, you know, version of the White House press briefing room, and having all these like press conferences in it, that a lot of queer speakers and performers came and it was either open mic for the public, or, you know, we had these sort of performances within it. So still bringing in a very like queer perspective and thinking about things, but not just being sort of for the queer community. And then the project I'm working on right now it's just such a heavily political moment in the country, but is called Against Doom TV, and it's a imaginary TV network that my friend Amy Koshman and I have been putting together, because this museum in Brooklyn called the Old Stonehouse Museum has invited us to do something about the election and to get out the vote, but it opens on October 22nd, which is you know, like less than 2 weeks before the election. So to try to do something about such a consequential election when you don't know what's going to happen, and one that's going to have huge impacts for queer people, because we really don't have a queer positive government right now. And so what the TV show is sort of encouraging people to get out and vote, but also encouraging them to think through, well, we have these two kind of old white guys who aren't totally in touch with, you know, I mean, one of them is out of touch with everything, and one of them is pretty out of touch, and is sort of, this is something I think about a lot, is are we caught in a cycle of saying no to things so much that we don't have energy to actively envision what we want to say yes to and what an alternative system might be? So we're kind of saying, okay, so vote, but think about that as a form of harm reduction. And then what do we, like, as soon as we vote, let's move forward on thinking about what we can do to change the system from sort of a more base level. But instead of the project isn't aimed at kind of people who already are thinking that way. So instead it's kind of a very like absurdist, playful, getting really weird set of vignettes around the idea of different TV shows. So we'll have a lot of abolitionists speakers, most of them queer, most of them women, most of them POC, sort of coming in as guests on our various like game shows. We have a dating show. We're having an award ceremony. There's also an inauguration of not Trump. So this was just sort of a void of like, we're inaugurating just anybody but him. Oops, I said his name. And then, and then what's the other? Oh, and then we're having a seance in a sort of in a weird cemetery with these gravestones that say you, me, and us on them, kind of thinking about the existential moment that we're in. So it's just kind of like trying to use similar things to the Dyke Bar, instead of in terms of like the palette and the sort of using the work to sort of frame out a world and then have some conversations inside of that world, you know, about the thing. And so for me, it's always kind of like whatever, because I feel like for young artists who might be watching this conversation, it can feel like such a hard time to be trying to make work, because like who cares about art when the world's on fire, you know? It can feel like that, but I really, really believe that art is has a way of getting people to think about things or reconsider them from a new perspective, and kind of pull people into a conversation when they've kind of maybe feel too apathetic or overwhelmed by the news or whatever, to be able to stay engaged. And so I just put it out there that I feel like it's actually a time when we need this kind of work more than others, you know.
Totally. And I had that exact moment a few months ago. I just started my PhD in February, and my I had that crisis moment where I was like, what am I doing? What does this even mean? The world is on fire, and I'm like faffing around, like, you know, waxing lyrical about queer time and, you know, Dyke feminist like road movies and whatever I'm trying to work on at the moment. And I was like, what is this going to do? And then I, you know, did my full, like, you know, trajectory back over and thought about what's actually getting me through right now. And it's the work of other artists. It's, you know, it's music, it's film, it's TV, it's art and culture that's providing the, I guess the ammunition's a very aggressive word, so not that, but like the fodder or the material for me to kind of reclaim a sort of resilience and a hopefulness in this space. So it's definitely,
and I feel like tending to that history in a way that other generations will later really appreciate when they're going into the lesbian history archives, and they find, you know, like whatever the version of that is. I think there's this notion in the States around our anti-racism work and conversations we're doing a lot of, which, well, some of us are doing a lot of and some of us are not, but, you know, about the idea of being a good ancestor, and about the way of sort of making amends and healing for what one's ancestors have done or what they've gone through, and thinking about kind of being a good ancestor in this life. And I think there's something to being a good queer ancestor too, right? And so the sort of doing this work to make sure that these histories are thought about and recorded and talked about and kind of kept alive for the next generation to learn from, so that we aren't sort of reinventing the wheel, I think is sort of, if there is a version of being a good queer ancestor, I think that's part of the work. So I also meet you on the other end of your trajectory.
Yes. I think they're very sage words, and maybe a good point to end on.
You could keep going for a while.
On some queer hopefulness and like history nerding out.
I also want to say the sun has been setting here.
Oh, yes, which is a good metaphor.
Well, Jade, it was so good to talk to you.
I'd like to say it's been rising here too. Yes, it's been lovely to talk to you too. It's been an absolute pleasure. And
everyone who was part of this project, for you, for your research, and for everyone who came together and made it happen. I know Karen was leading a whole team of people there that pulled it together and did such an amazing job. And Jose was always a dream to work with. And so I just want to say thank you again to everyone. And I hope that someday I'll get to come over there and meet some of you in person for these conversations.
Yes, please. And also quickly, Doom TV, is there any way that anyone over here can access it, can see it?
I feel like I should say it's against Doom TV, because it feels
against. Okay, yes. It's a horror show.
Exactly. So the show opens on October 22nd, and we'll be having an event that's going to be recorded live, where we show each sort of vignette of the video, and have a bunch of abolitionist organizers kind of talk about some ideas through it, and also be open for audience questions, and then show another video and kind of do that again. So that'll be, I'm guessing with our time difference, it'll probably be at some absurd hour. It's at 7 p.m. New York time on October 22nd. I can send out a link for you guys to share, but that will also be recorded and shareable at some point. So, you know, if you want to like follow my Instagram or check out my website or any of that stuff, there will be information about that coming up.
Awesome. That sounds really exciting. And yeah, best of luck with the election. And hopefully it's
oh my God, I know.
Positive outcome. Yeah.
Yeah, for all of us.
Yeah.
And yeah, and also good luck with all of your research and PhD.
Thank you.
I know that it's a big moment for you in that too. And it's been great talking to you.
Yes, pleasure.
Right. Bye.
Bye.